Perfect. Thank you so much, Kaiser and Dr. Costello, for joining us today, and for all of our attendees. So nice to see so many familiar names and faces. I'm thrilled to be introducing our speaker today. Dr. Caitlin R. Costello, MD, is an associate clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, where she is the training director of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellowship Program and the medical director of Child and Adolescent Outpatient Services. She completed medical school and general psychiatry residency at Johns Hopkins University, fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at Columbia and Cornell Universities, and fellowship in forensic psychiatry at UCSF. Her interests include medical education, curriculum development, obsessive-compulsive and tic disorders, the interface between psychiatry and the legal system, and juvenile justice. We will hand it over to you, Dr. Costello. Thank you again for joining and sharing with us.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be talking about mental health and legal risks of youth social media use. Oh, I think my slideshow stopped. One second. Are you seeing in slideshow view?
In slideshow view, or like a, yeah, or
Okay.
I'm sorry, non-presenter view. But,
Okay.
oh.
Like it looks okay.
We can see like the notes and like the PowerPoint.
Okay.
That looks
Better?
perfect.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to talk about some of the clinical and legal risks associated with social media use in youth. We'll talk about the legal background and status of minors interacting online and talk about some ways that we can address these risks and advise patients and families around how their youth are interacting online. As we know, teens are highly involved and invested in social media use. A majority of teens continue to use YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat. Most teens visit YouTube and TikTok in particular daily, including 1 in 5 who say they do so almost constantly. Many of us think that 1 in 5 might be an underestimate of those who use them almost constantly, but that's how many who self-report using them almost constantly. And nowadays, these data are from the Pew Research Center, who does these surveys yearly, but the exact questions they change vary somewhat year to year. But the most recent one was the first one where they asked teens how many of them use chatbots. And now a majority of teens say they use chatbots as well. Most teens say that social media helps them feel more connected to their friends. However, about 1 in 5 say that social media sites hurt their mental health, and a growing share say they think they harm people their age. Parents are more likely than teens to cite social media as a threat to teen mental health. So 44% of parents and 22% of teens. 34% of teens get mental health information on social media. And a majority of this group says that these sites are an important source of mental health information on social media. This was, in fact, checked for the quality of mental health information they were getting on social media. Teens are more likely to think that social media is bad for their peers than it is for themselves. They were not asked why they thought it would be better for themselves than it was for their peers. Teens are more likely to say that social media sites hurt than help their sleep, productivity, and mental health. But they do see a more positive impact on their friendships than on their sleep, productivity, and mental health. 48% of teens say that social media harms people their age. which is up from 32% in 2022. So teens are growing more insight into the possible harmful effects. This talk is focusing on the risks of social media, which is not to say that there are no benefits of social media for teens. Just this talk is focusing on the risks. So I will mention that there are benefits to teens of social media use. Those can include socialization, community. Some teens are able to access communities of like-minded peers that they may not have access to offline. Education and digital learning, they can learn anything on social media nowadays, and it can level the playing field for teens who don't have equal access to educational opportunities because of the limitations of, for example, the school systems they're in, access to information that they may not be able to access otherwise, independence, access to crisis services, and so on and so forth. So the question of is social media bad for teen mental health is not as straightforward to answer as you might think. So studies that have aimed at revealing overall effects on mental health, or that are aimed at basically answering that question, is social media use bad for teen mental health, have had kind of messy results. For example, some of the largest studies have been a study by Orban et al. Across three large data sets with a total of 350 some thousand youth, found that the association between digital technology use and adolescent well-being was negative, but quite small, 0.4% of variation. And then a 2020 review of meta-analyses, large-scale surveys, and longitudinal studies found a mix of associations, mostly small and unable to distinguish cause and effect. So if there was a negative association with well-being, they couldn't really tell if the negative well-being states led to more social media use or vice versa. Some more interesting effects have come from looking at some more specific relationships. For example, a new study, this is a cohort study, an Australian cohort study of 100,000 youth, found a U-shaped relationship between social media use and overall well-being, where moderate use was actually associated with optimal well-being, where high users had lower well-being and abstainers had lower well-being. And then um, somewhat smaller, but still large at 11,000 cohort study found that within-person increases in social media use during early adolescence were prospectively associated with greater depressive symptoms 1 year later, whereas depressive symptoms were not associated with a later increase in social media use. So young adolescents who had an increase across a year of social media use had more depressive symptoms 1 year later. And then a smaller cohort study found that high peaking and increasing social media use trajectories, so trajectories that they described as addictive, so really escalating patterns, were associated with greater internalizing, externalizing symptoms and suicidality. So these studies that are finding kind of more specific negative effects have been exposing some sort of interesting insights into perhaps some windows of vulnerability. So one longitudinal study of 17,000 participants ages 10 to 21 found that higher social media use predicted decreased life satisfaction 1 year later in young adolescent and old adolescent girls, so girls 11 to 13 and 19 years old. But for boys, it was mid-adolescence and at the oldest end of the adolescent cohort, so boys 14 to 15 and 19 years old. So there may be age vulnerability windows that may be different according to gender. The mental health effects also may vary according to pattern of engagement. So, a longitudinal study of 500 adolescents found that in girls, but not in boys, social media use in early adolescence and increase over time predicted suicidality. And then the type of engagement in social media appears to be important. So, a meta analysis of studies looking at social media use during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic found that most showed a small association between social media use and ill being, so the opposite of well being, and that the type of use that involved one-to-one communication, self-disclosure in mutual online friendship, positive and funny experience actually mitigated feelings of loneliness, whereas social media use that involved social comparison, fear of missing out, and exposure to negative contents was associated with ill-being. All of this adds up to, the relationship between social media use and well-being is complicated, but there's enough concern there that in 2023, the Surgeon General put out a warning of social media and youth mental health. The warning was a little bit wishy-washy, that just said, be aware. But the reference list is actually pretty good. If you of what was out there to date in 2023, and it's worth taking a look at. So where do the risks come from, and what kinds of risks are there? So, there are clinical risks and legal risks, and in some areas they overlap. But risks: depression, anxiety, overall decreased well-being, social comparison. So, social media use often, really displays very curated versions of other people's lives and encourages people to look at their own life and see that it may not stack up well in comparison. And teens, especially, may not really fully internalize that they're not looking at a realistic snapshot of all of the ups and downs of other people's lives that they're seeing posted online. Exposure to negative mental health content, and social contagion of some of the stuff they're seeing online, cyberbullying, which can have significant negative mental health consequences. Uh, Sexting and the consequences of images being sent on to unintended recipients and so forth. Exposure to substance use, which does have research demonstrating that can lead to increased substance use. And social media addiction, which is getting a lot of press around recent litigation. The literature on social media addiction is definitely still evolving, and there is recent literature, showing that at least some teens have use patterns that look similar to other kinds of behavioral addictions. Legal risks to youth can also come from cyberbullying and sexting, exposure to online solicitation and predation on either side, cyber stalking, cyber harassment, and then, a big bucket of things that I would just call reputation damage. The consequences of ill-considered posting that gets received by the audience in unanticipated ways or viewed by unanticipated audiences. Um, Admissions officers and employers, when they've been surveyed, a significant number of them say, yes, we do look at social media posting and making decisions. Even criminal consequences. So, for example, social comparison. This is a recent meta-analysis that was pretty interesting, that demonstrated relationships between high social media use and high social comparison and body image concerns, and all of this in eating disorders. This is a 2025 meta-analysis. Of course, Instagram knew all of this as early as 2021, when its own internal documents were leaked, showing that they knew perfectly well that Instagram was bad for teen body image. We make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. Teens blame Instagram for increases in the rate of anxiety and depression. This reaction was unprompted and consistent across all groups. And internal researchers concluded issues were partly specific to Instagram, especially social comparison. So even Instagram knew that it was Instagram and not just social media use in general that was bad for teen girls. Speaking of Instagram, Exposure to negative mental health content is another issue. So, on Instagram and other social media sites, generally self-harm content is supposed to be banned. But I just did an Instagram search for self-harm, and I had to make an Instagram account to do this. I don't have Instagram, and this is what came up right away. So if I can find this, imagine what teens are finding. It's not just Instagram. Here's an article about TikTokers using hashtags to discuss self-harm. Speaking of TikToks, so social contagion a few years ago, you may have heard about TikTok ticks. This was a trend of, not a TikTok trend, but a trend we were seeing in clinics of teen patients, mostly girls, presenting with unusual presentations of tics that didn't fit the typical clinical pattern. They were much more sudden and in onset, and presented much more um, prominently with complex vocal tics. Um, and many of them had seen other teens on TikTok presenting with similar tics. Another risk area that overlaps with clinical and legal risks is cyberbullying. So, the recent Pew Research data show that a majority of teens have been victimized in some way by cyberbullying. The CDC calls cyberbullying basically any unwanted aggressive behavior by another group or group of youths who are not siblings or current dating partners that involves an observed or perceived power imbalance and is repeated multiple times or is likely to be repeated. So, one thing about cyberbullying that differentiates it and can make it more insidious than offline bullying is that the power differential doesn't have to be that big when it's online. And also, when it's online, it can be really pervasive and constant because it doesn't end when school is done for the day. Cyberbullying is associated with depression, anxiety, behavioral issues, eating disorders, irritability, self-pity, decline in school performance, truancy, and somatic issues in both the victim and the bully. There's an elevated risk of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and suicide death, again, in both the victim and the bully. Youth who are at higher risk for being cyberbullied include those with learning differences or disabilities, sexual and gender minorities, Black and Latinx youth, and female. The factors that increase the risk for psychopathology include feelings of not belonging or social isolation, perceived burdensomeness, presence of pre-existing psychopathology, higher ACEs scores, and increased severity of the cyberbullying itself. The good news there is all states have some way of combating cyberbullying. So there are criminal sanctions in 44 states, school sanctions in 45 states, school policy in 49 states. 17 states specifically allow for off-campus behavior to be prosecuted, but federal case law allows for prosecution of cyberbullying in all states. So even for states that don't have specific cyberbullying laws, um, federal case law allows for there to be some action taken. Sexting, also an area where there's potentially criminal and clinical risk. Sexting can be associated with fear, stress, and shame for both the sender and the receiver. Girls are disproportionately affected. Associated with increased risk of suicide attempts and suicidal ideation, anxiety and depression, delinquent behavior, alcohol, drug use, and smoking associated with earlier age of sexual activity, multiple sexual partners, and decreased likelihood of using contraception. Sexting is a pretty normative behavior among teens, and yet it does have significant risks. Depending on your state laws, sexting even between same age youth may be considered criminal activity as the transmission of child sexual abuse material. In states without laws exempting sexting, teens who engaged in sexting could be charged as both offender and victim. In many of these states, consensual real life sex between teens 16 and older is legal. So you could have a scenario where teens can have sex with each other, and that can be legal, but it's illegal for those same two teens to sext with each other. Here's a map of how the states approach teen sexting. Um, New Mexico is in a green state, so there's some kind of exemption for teen sexting. Um, California's in a red state, so this just falls under the child pornography statute, and teens could be prosecuted for, consensual sexting between peers. Prosecutors are not particularly interested in going after these teens, unless it's a situation like one teen then, sends the image onto the whole school or something like that. Exposure to online solicitation and predation continues to be an issue. Sextortion, in the last few years, has received significant attention and is something that is really worth talking to patients about, to make sure that they're aware of the risks and of the fact that someone that they're talking to online may not be a fellow teen, even if they say they are. A couple of years ago, Forbes reviewed TikTok live streams and found that viewers regularly use the comments to urge young girls to perform acts that appear to toe the line of child pornography. Viewers were offering girls TikTok gifts and off-platform payments. Teens can get into legal trouble for social media activity as well. Sometimes social media trends that teens get caught up in result in criminal behaviors. This was a recent one from just a couple of weeks ago, actually, where 8 teens were arrested after a TikTok trend um, led them to storm a trampoline park. I'm not totally sure what the goal was there, but they caused enough disruption that the police were called and there were 8 arrests. So, speaking of the legal risks of this, it's important to understand a little bit of what the legal background of teens interacting online is. And when you agree to the terms of service of a social media site, you're entering a contract with the site. When you click I agree on the terms of service on an app or social media site, you're entering a contract with the site. Courts have generally agreed for adults that click wrap and browse wrap agreements create valid contracts binding the user to the terms of the site. So a click wrap agreement is where you click yes or I agree. A browse wrap agreement is where by continuing to browse the site with the terms of service accessible on the website, it's assumed that you agree to the terms of service because they're there if you want to read them. The language of this dates back to when software used to come in boxes, and it was assumed, and the boxes were shrink wrapped. It was called shrink wrap agreements because by breaking the shrink wrap, you were agreeing to the terms of service of the software. So the question comes up, are children held to these click wrap and browse wrap agreements as well? And the interestingly, The answer kind of turns out to be yes. By case law, where this has come up in court, the contracts have generally been enforced, at least for teens 13 and up. And that's because the legal protections for children interacting online are based mostly in one federal law, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA, that applies only to children under the age of 13. This is a 2000 era federal law requiring parental consent for the use of children's personal information online. So this was enacted in the year 2000 out of concern that companies were directing online marketing to children and collecting personal information without parental consent or notification. Um, Even back then, it was criticized for cumbersome verification requirements, inadequate protection, and inadequate enforcement. It required things like the parent faxing a permission slip to the company, and certainly no parents are faxing anything um, there. I haven't seen a fax machine outside an academic hospital in a very long time. So this law applies to children under age 13, which is why many social media sites use 13 years as the minimum age for participation. But many of them don't do much to verify that age. Um, Surveys suggest that at least 40% of children ages 8 to 12 use social media, and that's the number who admit to it. So it may very well be more. Um, and teens ages 13 to 17 then have little protection online. And when this has come up in court, their click wrap and browse wrap agreements generally have been upheld as valid. This is despite the fact that other kinds of contracts are generally voidable by minors if the minor chooses to void them. And this is also despite the fact that juveniles ages 13 to 17 are recognized as non-adults in almost every other legal context. So I won't belabor these, but the Supreme Court recognizes that minors are not adults in a series of Supreme Court cases that specifically cited the fact that adolescents compared to adults are immature, less responsible. This was about sentencing of juvenile offenders, but again, the line of reasoning rested on the differences in behavior between adolescents and adults that apply just as well to all of these things that they do online that can also have serious clinical and legal risks. Minors are recognized and treated differently from adults under the law in almost every other area. They can acquire property but are considered incapable of managing it. We don't let them vote. We don't let them serve on juries, marry without parental consent, purchase alcohol, tobacco, or firearms. And as mentioned, a minor's contract is voided if the minor chooses to void it, except for these online contracts. So why is this important and a disconnect? Well, the adolescent brain is different from the adult brain. And when we say brain development continues until age 25, this is what we're talking about. So, changes in myelination, synaptic pruning, development of the prefrontal cortex, etc. This is the part, the brain development that occurs through adolescence and into the 20s is what affects primarily higher order judgment and decision making, and why we're now saying adolescence continues until age 25, except as of November of last year, if you didn't hear, adolescence now lasts until age 32, with the publication of a study showing four pivotal ages for your brain. So the middle, or the second of these age spans, from age 9 to 32, this epoch is marked by significant changes in connectivity. So you may be an adolescent without knowing it. My favorite study to illustrate what's happening in the adolescent brain that impacts directly the kind of decision making related to online activity was not a study of online activity, but it was a study by Steinberg and colleagues that looked at young people ages 10 to 30 and tested them on cognitive skills and psychosocial skills. So the cognitive skills were working memory, digit span, and fluency, verbal fluency. They found that those skills increased with age, as one would expect, but only until age 16, which is as one would expect. So, like if you take an IQ test, your raw score will top out around age 16. That's as, smart as you're ever going to get. I'm here to tell you that unfortunately it all is downhill from there. In contrast, psychosocial maturity matures, sorry, psychosocial skills mature at a very different rate. Um, so here's our cognitive skills maturing, topping out at age 16. Our psychosocial skills, risk perception, sensation seeking, impulsivity, resistance to peer influence, and orientation towards the future instead of toward the present showed a very different pattern. They increased with age, but they didn't start increasing until age 16. And they continued to increase such that the 26 and over did better than the 18 to 21-year-olds. So there's that graph. And if you look at the graph, it actually looks like the 15-year-olds did worse than the 10-year-olds. Now, that didn't reach statistical significance in that study, but other studies have shown that peak impulsivity occurs around mid-adolescence, which seems to be related to increased susceptibility to the effects of dopamine. So in some ways, that might be true that the 15-year-olds are worse in psychosocial maturity than the 10-year-olds. But if you put these together, you can see that these mid-adolescents, around age 16 are in it's a very interesting period in time where their cognitive capacity is really high. They're very smart and their decision-making skills are very poor because they're not any better than they were when they were in fifth grade. And so they're in a perfect position to get themselves in lots of trouble. Um, in among other things, their online activities. The authors did note that context matters. So adolescents, by around mid-adolescence, can make good decisions in situations that permit deliberative, reasoned decision making with minimized emotional and social influences and with adult consultants available. In contrast, adolescents are likely to continue to make immature decisions in situations eliciting impulsivity, high levels of emotional arousal or social coercion, or not encouraging expert consultation. I would argue that online activity is much more the latter than the former. Teens tend to post very impulsively. They're highly emotionally invested online. They are highly influenced by their peers online and very rarely consult with adults before they post. So what do we do? I think there are basically two kind of categories of approach. So do we try to limit the ability of teens 13 to 17 to use social media that would recognize the vulnerability of this group? Or do we say we know they're going to do it and try to guide them in recognition of their impulsivity and poor consideration of risk? That would recognize that teens are technologically savvy, heavily invested, and likely to find a way around any age restrictions we try to impose on them. I'm not sure that I know the answer. And, social media guidance tips, have tried one or the other or hybrid approach. Legislation has tried one or the other or hybrid approach. I'm not sure any of us know the answer, but we can kind of think about, those sort of being the things to do. Um, should parents have to consent for teens to use social media? Most US adults support parental consent and time restrictions for minors using social media sites. Um, US teens, interestingly, are more likely to support than oppose social media companies requiring parental consent and age verifications. They're less likely than parents to support them, which is probably not surprising. But teens are showing some recognition that there's vulnerability there. Um, the verifying the age, at least social media companies will say it's impossible to do, although their algorithms sure seem to know how old the user is. So what do parents do? I encourage parents to monitor their teenagers' online activities as much as possible. Most surveys show, and these are self-report surveys, that parents don't monitor their teens' online activities very much. And that's, even how much parents are reporting that they monitor teens' online activities. Um, yet, yes, teens can create secret accounts that parents don't know about. It's not going to be perfect, and they can engage their teens in conversation about what they're posting online. The more they know, the better, the more they're able to discuss the risks with their teen to warn them about pitfalls. They can at least know what platforms and apps they're using, each of which have particular risks associated with them, depending on how the app is structured. I can still remember when I was a child psychiatry fellow and I first learned about Snapchat. I'm dating myself here, but when I had a teen patient who showed up in the ED with suicidal ideation because she didn't realize that a sexually explicit photo she sent to someone could be screenshot. She thought it would disappear. And that's how I learned about that risk of Snapchat. But I think it's important for us and for parents to know the specific risks of the specific apps that their teens are using. So engage them in discussion of posting habits and decision. We know that consultation with adults is one of the factors that leads to bitter decision making among adolescents. Parents do face potential legal liability for their children's online behavior, and maybe knowing that would help parents be more involved. Um, the American Academy of Pediatrics has a pretty good family media plan. Parents themselves can be an example for their teens of healthy media habits. Schools play a role. There are good digital citizenship curricula available. It's never too early. Kindergarten's not too early to start talking about digital citizenship. Clinicians, of course, play a role as well. I think it's really important for all of us to be assessing all of our patients' online behaviors and discussing the risks with them. Um, be mindful of the tendency of adolescents to find a way around parental restrictions, any legal restrictions that happen to be in place. Awareness of the little oversight afforded to our adolescent patients. They're essentially, treated as adults. With some recent legislative attempts, these laws that are coming up in various states are often getting enjoined and blocked and diminished in the courts. The lobby efforts against them are heavy. There's a lot of money invested in keeping kids online. The stakes there are high. And then, we can help with damage control when our teens do post something that gets them into trouble as well. So learn the what and the how. What apps are they using? What are they viewing? What are they posting? Try to keep up with the landscape. I'm not myself, a social media person at all. I have no personal interest in engaging with social media. I keep up just enough to be able to know what my patients are doing, and because I have an interest in the mental health effects and the legal landscape. Um, I think it's always a good place to assess the positives first. So our teens are interacting online for a reason. So what are they getting out of it? And, how can they get the best reward to risk ratio possible? Social connections, facilitation of positive in-person connections, positive impacts on mental health. So we know from some of the literature that one-to-one interactions, mutual disclosures, sort of sharing positive content, etc., has been associated with increased well-being. And then assessing the risks. Are online connections taking the place of in-person connections? Are they being exposed to upsetting and traumatizing content? Negative impacts on mental health? Assess for specific risky behaviors, facilitation of potentially dangerous in-person activities, posting content that's likely to result in reputation damage, facilitation of substance abuse, exposure to cyberbullying, cyberstalking, online predation, sexting. When you're talking about sexting, you should be aware of whether you have a mandated reporting obligation. So in California, um, transmission and reception of sexually explicit content of minors is reportable under our mandated reporting statute. You need to be aware of what your state statutes say about that. And then assessing how we can be helpful, education of risk, safety planning, damage control, evaluation and treatment of mental health symptoms, recruiting parents to be a proactive part of this. I've seen a lot of parents who are sort of overwhelmed and helpless and think that it feels really out of their control. And really kind of empowering them to play an active part. The American Academy of Pediatrics, has some good anticipatory guidance for sexting. The American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry has some good information on their websites as well. Be aware of pending legislation. Um, so there, is state legislation in various states, and then there's a federal bill, COPPA 2.0, kind of in the works. So this is a Senate bill that was adopted by the U.S. Senate in March, that would expand protections to teens 13 to 16 years old. And so, instead of just under 13, it would expand the age range to 16, and then to everyone in the 0 to 16 range. It would also add the rights to correct and delete personal information. For teens, the right would be given to teens, and then for 0 to 12, the right would be given to the parents. So we'll see what happens with that one. In New Mexico, there was very recently, a large jury verdict against Meta, for where they were found to be harmful and addictive to children. And there are a number of cases like this, um, in various stages now. So this is something to keep an eye on as well. And then, just we as a community, I think it's important to be aware of existing and pending legislation. This landscape is evolving and changing quickly. Um, we can advocate participation in educational programs for youth and parents. Consider how we ourselves participate with social media and engage with social media. Consider, our relationship to these companies. Consider how we're being a role model for teens, for parents, for the community. Um, few resources. So American Academy of Pediatrics has some Good Things Family Media Plan. NCMEC has some good resources for ex exploitation for sexually explicit materials that may have ended up online, either through sexting that then got out of control of the original sender, or otherwise. The Institute of Digital Media and Child Development has some good resources as well. And I am happy to take questions.
Would love to jump in. So, hi, Dr. Kane. So, I was involved with the trial against Meta, and so it was quite an experience. And
Oh, I would love to talk to you more about that.
we're gonna talk. We'll connect. I was thinking
That would be great.
we should be talking, yeah. And so, um, the data that the whistleblowers leaked is just shocking how much they knew and put a dollar sign on each of our children's heads. Thus, that's why they're each valuable and really worrying about safety for our kids. And I also have a 0 to 5 clinic where over time we have seen more and more really aggressive kids. And it's not infrequently associated with the screen time and taking it away from kids. And I've seen very little bitty kids can be, they have that primal response and they don't have any capacity to think, well, maybe I might break a window. I've seen windows broken. I've seen kids try to jump out of cars when they're driving. And then figuring out over time that what the link was, and it was shocking to me that it was such a response, so dangerous. And most of us here, I guess only my fellows now, we're talking about this and they're learning about this, but none of us had this part of a training curriculum. Didn't know how to screen for it. We didn't know what the dangers were. I myself learned about it on inpatient when there was a young woman who had been trafficked, and on social media, it was Instagram at the time. And yeah, it opens this door of what do we do? So I do have a question for you for your outpatient clinics. This is something that we're working on. Do you have a process for screening in your role as a medical director? What are you guys working on?
We do. So we as so I'm in the fortunate position of being both medical director and fellowship director. So, we teach the fellows as part of their initial evaluation of all of their patients to include a social media use assessment, which includes questions about how much time they spend online, what social media platforms they use, and what they're specifically doing on those platforms. And we include some questions about specific behaviors of concern.
So a scale in terms of screening for social media use disorder, is that
We don't have a social media use disorder scale.
so
It's
screen?
it's more just a set of questions about their specific social media use behaviors, so we can identify areas of concern that we want to follow up on.
Awesome. Does anyone else have questions? I don't want to take up anyone's time.
Yes, I just had questions about if in our resident clinic or by our wonderful presenter, if they, Dr. Costello, if they have heard of any research into parent groups that kind of band together and make rules about social media use. And if that could help some of the overwhelm.
Yes, and I actually think it's there. I know of some schools in the Bay Area where parents have gotten together and made rules for their teens about social media use. It seems like a really good idea to me because um, it the the lone child who has a social media restriction feels so left out of their peer group, but if their whole peer group has a social media use restriction, then everyone's in the same boat.
Mhm. Yes.
I've also heard of parent groups who all agree to delay getting their kids a smartphone until a certain age, which also seems like a great idea to me. The longer you can go before kids get access to social media in the first place seems
Yes,
really
yes, I
helpful. And
totally,
again, if you're not the only kid, it's so much easier.
yes, I totally agree. Yes.
Dr. Costello, you mentioned sort of related to that, like how important it can be to empower parents. And I love that too, because like, right, when the parents like, there's no way I'm going to get them to cut back, then it's
Mhm.
shifting it to like, okay, well, what can the parent do that the kid doesn't have to actually do anything sort of themselves, like a conscious choice. And I'm wondering if you have ways you like to talk to parents to sort of empower them in those ways, or like sort of like small steps you might start them on or encourage them to like
Yeah.
home or successes you've had. Would love to hear about that.
Yeah. So, one thing that was helpful for us, and sorry that this is a locality specific one, but you may have something parallel, was that California recently implemented a ban on cell phones in schools. And so that was sort of a good place to take advantage of an opportunity to so it wasn't parents having to like wrench the phone out of the kid's hand at the end of the day, but can you extend the ban for a certain amount of time after school? So you don't get the cell phone back immediately after school, you get the cell phone back after you do your homework, or something like that. But I think you can think about similar sort of natural opportunities to tie it to rather than you get X hours of screen time a day, and then I have to wrestle the phone out of your hands. Can it be tied to you have to complete XYZ first and then do it? Or can it be not after school for if until whatever is completed? And do it in an incremental fashion like that and take the small wins.
I like that. Yeah, getting to reward rather than having to be the punisher and take
Right.
time. There's another question in the chat. Dr. Grace, I don't know if you're able to unmute and if you'd like to ask Dr. Costello, but if so, go ahead. Otherwise, I can read it.
One common topic that comes up for teens and families is the adults themselves not feeling equipped to counsel and model healthy electronic use themselves. Any suggestions for parent family educational materials, support groups, or the information they can be referenced to? I would recommend taking a look at the AAP's family media plan and just doing it together as a family. And I think it's great to I think it's actually great for parents to be able to acknowledge it's something they to their teens that it's something they need to work on as well. Teens are pretty good at sensing hypocrisy. And if parents really need to work on their own cell phone use, um, and are trying to enforce it in their teens, that's not going to go over as well. But, if parents are able to just very honestly say, look, it's something we all need to work on, and then really go through with working on it all together, that, being really genuine about it is likely to be more successful. And also be willing to let their team contribute ideas too, and use them if they're reasonable for how the whole family should approach it.
I would like to say that Meta's one of their biggest defenses was it's a parent's responsibility. Parents are not engaged. Parents are, it's so preparing for that. It was information from Meta themselves about studies looking at parents feel ill-equipped. It's not easy to, like, even on like Instagram, to find where to report something bad that happened. And if you're a parent, you can't report it on your teen's account. You have to report on your own account, and then that gets lost, and then no responses. And so, universally, I think parents have been fed information and that it's, that we're protecting your kids, which is not at all correct. And it's really isolating for a lot of parents. They don't know what to do. They feel like their child is just, they've failed at parenting and their child is problematic. Their behaviors are problematic. And it's so common. So I love the idea of having a group get together and talk about these issues. It's really, really hard, yeah, for parents.
Any final questions while we have Dr. Costello with us? Otherwise, I see we're at the end of the hour. Kaiser, I don't know if there's any final housekeeping things we should do.
No, I'm gonna share the QR code to sign in right now. And if there's nothing else, thank you everyone for joining the Grand Rounds. And Dr. Costello, thanks again for presenting.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Such a privilege. And I'll reach out to you. I'll be reaching out.
All right, thank you.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you.